We are on Tes Amud Aleph. We did the Mishnah yesterday. We did a little bit of the Gemara yesterday. But what we noticed is that there's a machlokus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai requires that the sukkah is made l'shem mitzvah sukkah, for the sake of the mitzvah. And therefore they said, if you make a sukkah before 30 days, before the Chag, and it's not made for the sake of the mitzvah of sukkah, you just make it as a hut for protection from the elements, then it's not kosher. And like Rashi spoke out, the reason why there's a difference between 30 days before, within 30 days and before 30 days is because once you make a hut within 30 days of Sukkot, even if it's not expressly for the purpose of the mitzvah, we assume, even Beis Shammai assumes that it's made for the purpose of the mitzvah because everyone's talking about Yontif. Everyone's talking about Sukkot. That's when we start learning the halachas and so forth. But Beis Hillel disagree. And they say that as long as it's made for the protection from the elements, like we learned yesterday, then it's a kosher sukkah, even if it's not made specifically l'shem mitzvah sukkah. Okay, so the Gemara had asked the question yesterday, why does Beis Shammai insist that there's a requirement that it be made l'shem sukkahs? And the Gemara had given us a pasuk that said, Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yamim Lashem, that you have to have a festival of sukkahs for 7 days. And what we learned from there is that it has to be Lashem, it has to be for the sake, it has to be Lishma. It has to be that you make this sukkah for God. If you're not making it for the mitzvah, so then it's not kosher. Beis Hillel, however, has another use for that pasuk. What they learn from that pasuk is that just like a korban chagiga is for Hashem, and therefore it is usher for personal benefit, so too during the 7 days of Sukkot, a sukkah, one may not benefit from the construction materials of the sukkah. Okay, so now the question is, we're sort of like right in the middle of DAF Tes Amud Aleph, Beis Shammai nami biboyle lahachi. Doesn't Beis Shammai need the pasuk for that to teach me that there's a halacha that you cannot get personal benefit from the atzei sukkah, from the materials of the sukkah? The Gemara says yes, in hachinami. Yes, that's true. Elamai taimayu de Beis Shammai. But what is the real reason of Beis Shammai? Ksiv kra achrina. That there's another pasuk. Chag hasukos ta'aselacha shivas yamim. That you shall make for yourself a sukkah for 7 days. Which means what? What does that import? Sukkah ha'asuya l'shem chag ba'inan. That, there's another pasuk. The previous pasuk was from Sefer Vayikra. This pasuk is from Sefer Devarim, and it's an additional pasuk that says that it has to be made for 7 days as a chag, meaning that it has to be sanctified like a korban. It has to be for the sake of the mitzvah. Ubeis Hillel, hahu miboyle. So Beis Hillel says that pasuk also we need for a different halacha. La'osin sukkah b'cholo shel moed. Beis Hillel has a totally different view of that pasuk. That pasuk is coming to teach me that I have an obligation to make a sukkah even if I didn't make it before sukkahs. If on Chol HaMoed I discover that I neglected to make a sukkah before, this additional pasuk says still make a sukkah. And Ubeis Shammai svirlu Rabbi Eliezer de Amar Enos in sukkah b'cholo shel moed. And Beis Shammai hold like Rabbi Eliezer. We'll learn about this machlokas later on. Rabbi Eliezer says you're not permitted to construct the sukkah during Chol HaMoed, and therefore they don't use that. Obviously, they don't have the pasuk teaching me that because they hold that that's not the halacha. Now, frek the Gemara, a totally different question. You're telling me that it's only Beis Shammai who require that this, based on their pasuk, that the sukkah has to be made lishma, l'shem mitzvah sukkah. Ubeis Hillel leslahu de Rav Yehuda Marav. There's a general statement that was attributed to Rav, which is that all mitzvahs have to be constructed lishma, that anytime you're building or making a tashmishay mitzvah, something that's used for a mitzvah, it has to be made for the sake of the mitzvah. The Amar Rav Yehuda Marav, Asa min hakotzin umin hanimin umin hagaradin pisula. Rav was quoted as saying by his student Rav Yehuda that when you're regarding the mitzvah of tzitzis, what is tzitzis? Tzitzis are fringes, are threads or strings that are on the corners of your garment. Let's say you're a tailor and you're making a garment, and before you hem the garment, you say, you know what, this is a four-cornered garment. I already have strings or threads that are dangling from the weave at the edge of the garment. let me use the corner dangling threads that are still there. I'll just hem everywhere else. I won't hem the corners, and those strings or threads that are dangling from the edge, those will act as my tzitzis. So Rav said that doesn't work. Doesn't work because the threads or strings that are dangling from the weave or from the stitch were not put there in the first place for the sake of tzitzis. And since they weren't put there in the first place for the sake of tzitzis, then it's not good. However, minasis and kishera. If, however, a person were to take strings that had been spun already, not for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis, that you took threads and you spun them into string, and then you take these thick strings and you attach them to the corners for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis, that is kosher. There, it's not as bad, because whereas in the first case, the strings are already attached and they were attached to the garment, not for the sake of tzitzis, here, there's merely the spinning of the threads into string that was not done lishma. But the attachment of the strings to the garment is done l'shem tzitzis, and therefore it's okay.
Is that the halacha?
Well, you'll see. That's technically the halacha, but ki amri say, kamei dishmul amarli af minasisa nami pesula. And Rav Yehuda then said that after Rav passed away, and I had to go, my new Rosh Yeshiva was Shmuel, I quoted him this halach in the name of Rav, and he told me, I disagree. He said to me, I hold that even the teviyah, even the spinning of the threads into string, has to be done l'shem mitzvah tzitzis. So what do we paskin? If I'm not mistaken, we paskin like Rav, me'ikar hadin, that the teviyah, the spinning of the threads into the strings themselves, does not have to be done lishma. However, lechatchila, we do require to go like Shmuel, that the teviyah was done lishma as much as the placement of the strings was done lishma. And that's why, you'll see on the little the petek of the kashrus of the strings, when you buy just the bundle of strings, it'll say teviyas yad, that it was spun by hand, because it's supposed to be done l'shem mitzvah tzitzis, even the teviyah.
What does it mean, asiyat sukkah lishma? The mitzvah of sukkah is not to build a sukkah, the mitzvah is leisha sukkah.
And the mitzvah of tzitzis is to wear tzitzis, or to have tzitzis on your begadim. So you could argue the same thing by tzitzis. The Gemara's question is that you see that tzitzis seems to be the exemplar that anytime you're manufacturing something for a mitzvah, it has to be manufactured lishma.
So if a boy built a sukkah for you, you're old, you're sick, whatever.
That's the argument. That was yesterday's DAF. Yesterday's DAF was specifically about a Gentile building a sukkah. We paskin yesterday that it's kosher. The Gemara's question is, why is that true? You see that tzitzis has to be manufactured lishma. Why doesn't a sukkah have the same halacha? So the Gemara says, so you see, debayin and tviya lishma, hachanami nibaya sukkah suya lishma. So just like you need the spinning to be done, or the attachment of the strings at least, like Rab says, to be done lishma, we should also require the sukkah to be done lishma. The Gemara answers, Shaini hasam da'ar makra gedilim ta'ase lach l'shem chalvach. There's a special pasuk that's unique to tzitzis, that it says, make for yourself gedilim, which are these fringes on the corner of your garment. So therefore the Torah says lach, that it has to be done for your obligation. It can't be done for any other purpose. That's unique to tzitzis. But what are you talking about? It's unique. Hachanami chag asukos ta'ase lach l'shem chalvach. You have the word ta'aseh lecha. By sukkos also it says the word lecha or lach. So why is it any different sukkos from tzitzis? The Gemara answers, Hahumi boile lemeute gezula. The reason why you need the word lecha by sukkos is to tell you that it can't be from stolen materials. We'll learn later on, when we learn about lulav hagazol and we'll learn about sukkah gezula, it's a whole separate sugya of something that's stolen. Can you be yotzei the mitzvah with it if you put that stolen object and construct a mitzvah with it? So we'll see later on that you can't be yotzei, but the Gemara is saying that you learn that out from this pasuk, right? So you can't use this pasuk that it has to be done lishma, because we use this pasuk to tell me that it can't be from stolen material. But the Gemara says, "But hasam nami mi boy le'lemu'udei gezula." Why do we say the same thing by tzitzis? That the pasuk is not coming to tell me that it has to be done lishma, but rather it's telling me that it can't be from stolen materials. Hasam ksiv karachrina ve'asu lahem mishalahem. So the Gemara says by tzitzis you have two psukim. One pasuk is coming to tell me that it has to be done lishma, And the other pasuk of V'asu lahem tzitzis, make for themselves tzitzis, is coming to exclude if it's from someone else's property that it's stolen. But you can't be yotzei the mitzvah that way. But by sukkah, since you only have one pasuk, we use that pasuk to tell me that it can't be from stolen goods, and we don't have a special pasuk that it has to be done lishma. And that's why a sukkah, at least according to Beis Hillel, does not have to be built lishma. Weiter. Now that's all me'ikar hadin. The Mishnah Berurah says from the Achronim that me'ikar hadin, when you do have a non-Jew build the sukkah for you, it's appropriate for you to shake the schach so that you contribute in some way to the placement of the schach. Okay?
So would that be a similar case with tzitzis? In other words, just like you're lifting up the schach, that you can move the tzitzis that were on that beged? If you don't trace it all the way back to yad, that you have to do the yad. But
if the tzitzis are already attached,
I'm saying just move, loosen them, and then
no. But you'd have to detach them and reattach them. By the schach,
but
it's merely
that would be permitted though. The threads on that, the tail of
the threads, you'd have to detach them,
move them, and just place them there with the shame.
And reattach them. No, it's not just enough to move them. There's a difference between moving and detaching. Moving is not sufficient because just by moving your tzitzis, they're still attached.
Right. No, I'm saying you lift them up and then move them and put them back on again and
take it off.
When you say you're using two different terminologies. Okay. Lifting up is appropriate for schach.
Right.
Okay. You don't lift up an attached string off of a garment. You have to detach it. You'd have to untie it or cut it in some way, okay. And then you'd have to reattach it.
Right, l'shem.
Yeah, right. L'shem mitzvah tzitzis. Okay, Mishnah. Ha'osa sukaso tachas ha'ilan ki'ilu asa b'so chabayis. If you make a sukkah underneath a tree, that's tantamount to making a sukkah underneath a house, and therefore it's not kosher. Now, why the Mishnah has to use the analogy, we'll see in the Gemara. Sukkah al gabe sukkah, a double-decker sukkah. So, ha'elyona kshera v'hatachtona psula. The upper chamber is kosher, the bottom one is pasul. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ein diyurin bo elyona hatachtona kshera. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. We'll have to analyze Rabbi Yehuda shortly. And he says no, that as long as there are no inhabitants in the top sukkah, the bottom sukkah is also going to be kosher. Let's first talk about the tree. Amar Rava, lo shanu ela bi'ilan shetzilaso meruba mechamasa. Avol chamaso meruba mitzilaso keshera. So Rava makes the first statement, and he says that the only time that a tree poses a problem for a sukkah, if it's overhanging the sukkah, is if the tree is so lush with foliage that it provides more shade than sunlight. But if it's a weak tree, it's just got a few branches protruding over the sukkah, and it doesn't provide more shade than sunlight, so then it's okay. Mimai, and where do you see this from? Midiketani ki ilu asa b'so chabayis. Because the Mishnah provides the analogy that a tree overhanging a sukkah is like a sukkah in a house. Lama lila misni kilo asabiso chabayis. Listening psula. Just say it straight. Just say it's not kosher. Just say it's puzzle. Why do you say it's like making it in a house? Eloha kamash malan de ilan dumya debayis. Mabayis tzilaso meruba mechamaso. Af ilan tzilaso meruba mechamaso. But rather, it's coming to teach that just like when you put a sukkah in a house, the roof of the house provides more shade than sunlight, so too, when you make a sukkah underneath a tree, the tree is problematic only because it provides more shade than sunlight. So the Gemara says, now I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe this is a continuation of Rava's own teaching, because we have to clarify what Rava means. So the question is, we have to let's clarify what Rava means. Just because the tree is just a few branches and it doesn't provide more shade than sunlight, but it still should be a problem. Why? Because it's contributing to the shade of the kosher schach. And anytime you have something that contributes to, if you have a combination of kosher and non-kosher schach, and they're not mixed in with each other, so then there's no bittul, so to speak, of the non-kosher schach. And the non-kosher schach is a contributing factor to your sukkah, so that in itself should make the sukkah puzzle. Even if by itself it's not enough to provide the full shade, but if it's contributing to the shade of the sukkah, that in itself should disqualify at least the area where you're sitting under, right? So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Papa b'shechavtan. So Rav Papa says, you know what we're talking about? We're talking about where you took that branch and you bent it over and mixed it into your schach. In that situation, then you apply the principle of bittul. As long as you have more kosher schach than non-kosher schach, so you have what's called bittul barov. You nullify it because you have a majority of good stuff over bad stuff, so it's batal. Now Rashi makes a very interesting point based on this. Rashi says that if you have a roof that has airspace in between the slats, let's say you have a covered deck, right? Covered deck, and it has either lattice or it has, lattice might be a problem, but it has, it has more airspace than it has slats, but still, there's still slats all across. So as long as you have more schach than slats, that's a kosher sukkah. You can just put the schach in between the slats, and as long as there's 51% of the covering of that roof is schach versus slats, then that's a kosher sukkah. And you see that it's because you apply bittul barov. All you have to do is have a majority of schach versus non-schach, and it's together in the same surface, that it's okay. The only time there's going to be a problem is if you have a branch that's overhanging, that's not mixed in or combined with the schach. That's what creates a problem to sit underneath that area where the branch is. Because there you're getting the shade from that, or at least the contribution of the shade is coming from that branch.
Your case that you just gave now is not as bad as the tree, because the tree is mechuber l'karka, no? I mean, doesn't that make it worse? As opposed to what you just described?
No, because the slats are also mechuber l'karka, because the slats are part of a structure. They're nailed in and part of a frame that is ultimately attached to the ground. The schach can't be attached. That's the whole point. Okay, but
the branch is bare, it doesn't have leaves.
It still could be a problem if it's a thick branch and you're sitting underneath it. It's going to be a problem. So the Gemara says, "Ibishachavtan ma'ila memra." 1 second, says the Gemara, if you've already mixed the branch in with the rest of the schach, of course it's batal. Like, what's the chiddush here? So the Gemara says, "Mahu detema nigzer heicha dechavtan heicha delo chavtan kamashmalan delo gazrina." You might have thought that we should prohibit you from allowing you to mix in branches that are attached to the ground with kosher schach, lest you come to allow a branch that is not mixed in with the schach and let it just overhang your sukkah. So Kamash Malan, that's why you need Rava to tell me that we don't make such a decree. But the Gemara says, Hanami Tanina, but that also was taught. Because it says, look at the following brisa. Hidla aleha es hagefen ves hadalas ves hakisos besichei chalgabon pesula. If a person takes vines or from a grape orchard, from a vineyard, or if he takes vines from a melon patch, or if he takes ivy, or if he takes a grass moss that's growing on a tree or growing on a wall, he takes ivy, really, is really what it is, and he pulls it over while it's still attached to the ground, and he drapes it over his sukkah structure to make a roof, to make schach out of it, that's puzzle. However, v'im hayasicha charbe mehen o shekatzitzan keshera. But if there's already a majority of kosher schach, and he just wants to combine his vines into that, his growing vines into that mixture, then it's kosher because you have bittul barov. Or if draping it over and then cutting them, that also will work to make kosher schach. But the point that you see from here is, Shkoyach Rava, I don't need you to teach me that. I've already got that in a brisa, that as long as there's a combination of kosher and non-kosher covering of my roof, and you have more schach than non-kosher, then it's kosher. So the Gemara says, Hey Chidami, what's the case? Ilema b'shelo chavtan hakamit starif schach pasul schach kosher. So what is the case? If you're going to tell me that a person did not mix it in, so then how could you tell me that the ivy is kosher there by just allowing it to hang over and not mix in with the kosher schach? That's going to be a problem. So elolav b'shechavtan ushmamina delo gazrina. So you see that brisa is specifically telling me when you mix it in with the kosher schach, then it's kosher. So why did you need Rava to tell me that? So the Gemara says, Mahu detema hani mili b'di'evet aval lechatchila lo kamash malan. because you might have thought that that's only post facto. You asked the Shaila, was I Yotze the mitzvah because I had mixed my vines in? But maybe lechatchila it's not permitted to do that. So comes Rava along to tell you, when he's explaining and telling you what our Mishnah really means, he's telling you that what it means is that it's permitted even lechatchila to mix in from that overhanging tree, as long as you bend it over and mix it in with the kosher schach, it's perfectly okay. Okay, now let's go to our case of sukkah al gabe sukkah v'chulei. So Tanu Rabbanan, basukos teishva. The Torah says you must dwell in Sukkot. Below besukkah shetachas sukkah. So the Brisa infers from that wording that you can only live in a sukkah, but not a sukkah underneath a sukkah. So basically, the Brisa is telling you that it's exeris hakasav, that it's a divine decree that doesn't necessarily have any rhyme or reason having to do with structural issues. But basically, the Torah is telling you that if a sukkah is underneath another sukkah, you're not fulfilling the mitzvah. V'lo besukkah shetachas ha'ila, nor can you live in a sukkah that's underneath a tree. V'lo besukkah shebesoch habayis, nor can you live in a sukkah that's inside a house. The sukkah has to be under the sky, period. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, this brisa doesn't make any sense. Adarabba, basukos tarte mashma. Doesn't the word basukos imply more than one sukkah? And if so, if anything, it implies that you could have a sukkah on top of a sukkah, because it says live in Sukkot. So you see, I can live in a double-decker sukkah. So the Gemara says no. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak basukos ksiv. It says basukot without a vav, and remember we had learned from the previous sugya that sukkos without a vav implies one sukkah, not more than one. Amar Rebbe Yirmiyah, pa'amim sheshtein kesheros, pa'amim sheshtein psulos, pa'amim shetachtona keshera v'elyona pesula, pa'amim shetachtona psula v'elyona keshera. So Rebbe Yirmiyah makes the following statement. He says, you know what? The truth is that there are 4 different permutations. Sometimes both the top sukkah and the bottom sukkah will be kosher. Sometimes both the bottom sukkah and the top sukkah will be puzzle. Sometimes the lower one will be kosher and the upper one will be puzzle. And sometimes the upper one will be puzzle and the bottom one will be kosher. So let's go through all 4. Pa'amim sheshtehen kisheros hechidami. One would be an example of when both sukkahs are kosher. Kegon shetachtona chamasa meruba mitzilasa, v'ha'elyona tzilasa meruba mechamasa. The case would be that the lower sukkah has the lower sukkah is not a kosher sukkah because the schach that's over the lower sukkah is insufficient. So because it's got more sun than shade. The top sukkah has more shade than sun, and therefore the top sukkah is the only one with the kosher schach. And therefore it's really you look at it as one big sukkah, not a double-decker. The kaima elyona besoch esrin. And the upper sukkah is within 20 amos. So basically what you have is one big sukkah, one tall sukkah, that's lower than 20 amos. So both the upper sukkah and the lower sukkah, in other words, let's say theoretically, a guy would want to climb up on the schach that's on the lower level, even though it's not kosher schach because it's insufficient, but he'd want to sit on top of that, that would also be fine.
How do you have, I'm a bit confused, how do you have a lower and upper if there's schach on the lower, but there's...
How do you not fall through, you mean?
No, how do you have, it doesn't go to this thing. There's 2...
Okay, I'll give you the illustration. You've got walls that go up 19 amos high.
Okay.
You put kosher schach on top of that. But in the center, midway up, you put a few slats of wood that act as kosher, that would be, if you had sufficient slats, would be a kosher sukkah. However, there's insufficient because you space them, you only put down 5 slats, and you space them so widely that's not kosher schach. Your kid is a monkey, and he decides that he wants to climb to the upper part of the sukkah. So therefore, we're saying that both the top part of the sukkah and the bottom part of the sukkah are judged as one big sukkah, and whether you're sitting on top of the slats or on the bottom, it's a kosher sukkah. It's one sukkah. Period. Okay? Next. So now let's look at what's the case of when both the top one and the bottom one are puzzle? Both the top and the bottom have abundant schach. Both of them have more shade than sunlight. So the bottom one is puzzle. Why? Because it's a sukkah tachas a sukkah, right? It's a sukkah below a sukkah. Why is the top one puzzle? Because v'kaima elyona lemaila me estrim ama. because the top one is higher than 20 amos. Someone asked me a very interesting question this morning. They said, what do you mean the top one is higher than 20 amos? From the floor of the top one, it's not higher than 20 amos, so why should that be puzzle? Are you telling me that if you make a sukkah on a rooftop of an apartment building, it's not kosher? Of course not. You measure from the floor going up. My response to them was as follows. That's an excellent question, but my response to them was that one of the reasons that we held that a sukkah that's higher than 20 amos is puzzle is because the walls of such a sukkah have to be so strongly reinforced so that it doesn't have a status of diras keva anymore, diras aryai anymore, temporary dwelling, because you have to make the walls very strong and sturdy. So therefore, in a double-decker sukkah where the walls from the bottom one are the same walls as the top one, that would be the reason why, even though where you're standing, you can very clearly see the ceiling. It's not 20 amos high from your perspective, from where you're standing, but since the walls of the sukkah were constructed in a more keva fashion, that's why the top sukkah is puzzle. Okay, pa'amim shetachtona kesheira. So that's where both sukkahs are puzzle. The top one is puzzle because it's higher than 20 amos. The bottom is puzzle because it's a sukkah tachas a sukkah. Pa'amim shetachtona kesheira vo'elyona pesula heichidami. So what was the third permutation? Where the bottom one is kosher, the top one is puzzle. What's the case? Kigon shach tachtona tzilasa meruba mechamasa ve'elyona chamasa meruba mitzilasa. So you have the bottom sukkah. The bottom sukkah has its shade is sufficient. It has abundant schach. The top sukkah has insufficient schach. So standing on top of the bottom sukkah, you're not standing in a kosher sukkah. But v'kaimi teravayu b'soch esrim. But both the top and the bottom are within 20 amos. Why? Because if the top sukkah was higher than 20 amos, then the schach on top of it would be pasel schach, just like an overhanging tree. And that would pose a problem to the bottom sukkah. But if it's within 20 amos, so even though it's insufficient in and of itself, it can contribute, because it's kosher schach, it can contribute to the bottom sukkah and not create problems. And then finally, the fourth permutation is pa'amim sha'alyona kshera v'atachtona psula heichidami. One is the top sukkah kosher only, and then the bottom sukkah is puzzle. Kagon de teravayu tzilasa meruba mechamasa, where both have sufficient and ample schach. I'm sorry, you're right, both have sufficient and ample schach. V'kaim alyona b'soch esrim. And the top one is within 20 amos. So therefore, only the top one is kosher, because it's a kosher sukkah, but the bottom one is a sukkah tachas a sukkah. The other one is a sukkah below a sukkah, beneath another sukkah, and therefore it's pasuk. So the Gemara says, Pshita. Rabbi Yirmiyah seems to be telling me something that is fairly obvious. Once I know the halacha that a sukkah beneath a sukkah is not kosher, then why did Rabbi Yirmiyah need to give me four permutations that really are just taking applying halachas of things that I already know and just spelling it out for us? What is Rabbi Yirmiyah adding? So the Gemara answers, Tachtona keshera ve'elyona pesulitz derichalei. The chiddush of his was the third permutation, where when the bottom sukkah is kosher and the top sukkah is pasel. Where what was the case? Where there's ample schach on the bottom sukkah, but insufficient schach on the top sukkah. And as we said, as long as the top sukkah is within 20 amos, it's kosher. You might have thought that we should answer that situation as well, midarabanan, because maybe in certain situations you would make the top sukkah higher than 20 amos, and therefore, even though there's insufficient schach, but since that schach is pasel because it's higher than 20, it's contributing to the bottom schach, and it's not bottled to that bottom schach because it's not mixed in with it, and therefore would create problems in pasel the bottom sukkah. So therefore, in that case it would be problematic, we should answer all cases of a double-decker sukkah. We would always say that the bottom one is pasel. So kamash malan that we don't say that as long as there's insufficient schach in the top one for a kosher sukkah, then the bottom one will be kosher as long as the top sukkah is within 20 amos. That's the chiddush. We'll hold it here for today.